Thank you so much. Thank you for coming. Shad, thank you so much for being my friend, and thank you for allowing me to come. It's a great pleasure to be here. And it's a great pleasure, Alessandro and Phil and, Kieran and just new friends and old. It's just wonderful to be here with you. So anyway, I want to tell a story that's based in the U.S. This is a U.S.-based story. But I think that there'll be some interesting resonances, I hope, between the case in the U.S. and the cases that you see in your work and lives every day. I'm working with people that we've learned to be afraid of, people that we've decided to throw away. And this, in this case, is a story about mass incarceration and what I call its afterlife. It's about the journey home from jails and prisons and what that involves. And I want to talk about something that I write about as a supervised society. This is an alternate legal reality that we've erected through the law and policy mechanisms that we've dropped on people that we've learned to be afraid of, people we've decided to fear, people we've decided to hold in disdain, people that we've decided to push off to the side. And the premise is simple. I think we have to reimagine the problem if we're ever to change it. So we'll begin with how we think about the problem. And to do so, we'll borrow insight from two of my heroes. The first, of course, James Baldwin, as Shad mentioned. And the second, Nina Simone. To begin with Baldwin, the year is 1965, it's October, and Baldwin is famously debating William F. Buckley, a man called the, quote, father of American conservatism. This is at the Oxford Debate Society. The resolution in this case is whether or not the American dream is at the expense of the American Negro. Baldwin, of course, wins, because James Baldwin always wins. You can't lose if you're James Baldwin. The resolve, yes, of course, the American dream is at the expense of the American Negro, and there was an expense. There were costs involved. And these costs went so far beyond the practices of slavery. And when we think about slavery, we can think about labor that was stolen, because of course that was stolen labor. And we can think about exploitation, because of course that was exploitation. But really the question of whether or not the American dream was at the expense of the American Negro for Baldwin was absurd. It was 1965. In the United States, we had a Voting Rights Act that had just passed, but we also, of course, had voter intimidation. There was a Jim Crow South and redlining in the North. Whiteness, he said, was sustained through black suffering. In one of the most memorable lines of the debate, he reminds us of the black condition. Here's what he says. He says, now, leaving aside all the physical factors of which one can quote, leaving aside rape and murder, leaving aside the, quote, bloody catalog of oppression, which we are too familiar with anyway. What the system does to the subjugated is it destroys his sense of reality. In the case of the American Negro, he says, from the moment you are born, every stick, every stone, every face is white. Since you have not yet seen a mirror, you think that you're white too. It comes as a great shock, he says, around the age of 5 or 6 or 7 to discover that the flag to which you have pledged allegiance, along with everybody else, has not pledged allegiance to you. To see Gary Cooper, who at that time was a famous movie star, killing off the Indians, he says. You're rooting for Gary Cooper, but the Indians are you. This is Baldwin being Baldwin. William F. Buckley was simply overmatched. I, like most people, think his mind is exquisite, but I find the next passage particularly striking. This is what he says. It comes as a great shock to discover that the country to which is your birthplace and to which you owe your life and your identity has not, in its whole system of reality, evolved any place for you. The disaffection, the gap between people, only on the basis of skins begins there and accelerates throughout the whole life course. I say like Lisa's lifetime. You realize you're 30 and you're having a terrible time. You've been through a certain kind of meal, he says. And the most serious effect is, again, not the catalog of disaster, The policeman, the taxi driver, the waiters, the landlady, the banks, the insurance companies, the millions of details 24 hours out of every day which spell out to you that you are a worthless human being. It's not just that, he says. But you are 30 by now, and nothing you have done has helped you escape the trap. But what's worse is that nothing you have done, and as far as you can tell, nothing you can do, will save your son or your daughter from meeting the same end. The second hero is Nina Simone. It's 1962. This is a few years before. She's sitting at her piano for a live recording of Sinner Man at the Village Gate nightclub in New York City. Moaning in the break, the drum and hand clap driving the beat, each keystroke expresses the urgency of the moment. She's slender and striking in a white sleeveless gown. Her features, they feel pronounced. Her gaze focused, sometimes intense, sometimes directed toward the keys, sometimes toward her or her band or her audience. Her voice full and deep, a complement to a series of jangling but precise chords. She sings, "Oh yeah," her voice trailing now, accompanying the chords she plays with an intensity that's directed toward all of us, but no one in particular. She begins again, her audience on edge. This time the pitch is a bitch higher. "Oh, sinner man," she sings, "where are you gonna run to? Where are you gonna run to on that day?" Now this song was recorded 3 years before the passage of the Civil Rights Act that I mentioned. It allowed, for the first time in US history, substantive black citizenship. This is the emergence of it. Black people have been citizens since just 1965. This was, in fact, the emergence of citizenship, not some insurgent form of political membership, but for the first time, US law and policy recognized the need to protect black people and protect their political membership. The first time that the weight and force of the state could be brought down on folks who are just trying to defend their ability to participate in the civic life of their nation. A nation they, of course, fought and died for, and continue to fight and die for to this day. Medgar Evers, the civil rights hero, had not yet been assassinated in his driveway coming home from an NAACP meeting, which would mark the beginning of a suite of high-profile assassinations. 14-year-old Addie Mae Collins, 14-year-old Carol Denise McNair, 14-year-old Carol Rosamond Robertson, and 16-year-old Cynthia Wesley had not yet been blown to bits by a white supremacist at the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, Alabama. This was the story of the so-called 4 little girls whose murder changed the course of American history. 13-year-old Johnny Robertson and 16-year-old Virgil Ware had not yet been murdered in that very same city on the very same day, one by a cop, one by a white supremacist coming home from a rally, and those boys had not yet been lost to history. But black life was no easier in 1962 than it was in 1963 when more people paid attention. And it was no easier in Birmingham than it was in New York City's Harlem or Chicago's famous Bronzeville neighborhood, the neighborhood I grew up in. Where will sinner man run and hide to escape judgment that's all around him? He has sinned, which is to say, he has amassed a debt. He must repay it. The musician Les Baxter recorded a show tune cover of the song a decade before where sinner man runs to the moon. But this is a Negro spiritual, one that's been sung in black churches since the turn of the 20th century and whose roots ran much deeper. It was a song that should be sung with a tambourine. This was a warning and a call to prayer for the church to get right so they can go home. Nietzsche, of course, tells us that the origins of guilt come from the material relationship between a lender and a debtor. And this debt was a real one. The debtor, should he fail to pay what he owes, offers the lender his very flesh, or the flesh of his wife, or the flesh of his child to do with as he will. It's a sign of his free will to offer the one thing over which he has mastery. This, of course, is his body. The lender takes pleasure in torturing the debtor, and at the same time sears his conscience. The pain he inflicts will never be forgotten, and the debtor, and all who see his pain, will pay their debts from that point forward. This is not far from a distinctly American theological tradition, where a sin-sick world, where sin-sick souls owe debts to their God. In sinning, they've broken a contract, and the debt must be repaid. They must pay it with their flesh. This song was sung on the tail end of the 19th century. The survivors of the lash, they sang it, and they would continue to sing it through the coming Great Depression. If slavery was punishing, the hunger and disrespect that followed was nearly as bad. Miss Simone's version was like the one our great-grandmothers and great-aunts sang. It was a song of fire and smoke that strummed on bass guitars and well-tuned pianos. But the hand clap that she uses was reminiscent of a washboard, her moans of red lines and cotton thorns and slum clearance. The sinner man runs and hides on earth. His punishment comes from this world, from the southern horrors that Ida B. Wells famously chronicled, from the long trek north from the southern United States, from the crack of the police baton that greeted them in Harlem and Bronzeville and Black Bottom in Detroit. It was the sting of eviction and unsolved rapes and murders. It's the experience of unemployment and hunger. It's the pain you feel on the earth, not the moon. All while hearing from preachers and politicians and social scientists and do-gooders that move in and out of your neighborhoods with surveys and cameras and their best intentions in tow, that it's all really your fault. It's your refusal to snitch or to keep a man happy. It's your refusal to raise your children right or delay gratification, so say the economists. It's your refusal to shake off the deficits of your culture, say every form of social scientist that moves into your neighborhoods. This is what puts you into this position. It's your social disorganization, the sociologists say. It's your disbelief in the legitimacy of the law or law enforcement, so say the scholars of crime and punishment. At the end of the day, it's you. This version was recorded live at the Village Gate nightclub at the corner of Thompson and Bleecker Street in Greenwich Village. The song's protagonist is the sinner man who seeks respite on Judgment Day. And the song asks the question, where are you going to run to avoid judgment on that day? You've got a debt you've got to pay. God wants your flesh. He runs to the rock, to the river, to the sea, and he asks for help. Eventually he runs to God. He says, please hide me. Please help me, Lord. But sinner man finds no respite. The river boils, the sea bleeds. The rock says, I ain't going to hide you, guy. God says, go to the devil. And of course, the devil is waiting. In this parable, constructed from the traditions of the Southern Black Church, the sinner man knows that the devil will never be satisfied with his torment. That is, he knows that no amount of violence inflicted on his flesh will ever be enough. So he cries out, power, power to the Lord. But this is not an act of worship. This is a statement of fact. The fate of the sinner man is in the devil's hands. Now, Simone's prophetic lyric, like Baldwin's always timely discourses on race and the human condition, better than most capture the social situation of formerly incarcerated people today, who find themselves at the mercy of others, but rarely find mercy. For the formerly incarcerated who live in the post-civil rights era, there are few, if any, open doors in the labor market or in housing or even within their families. And just like the sinner man's confession of power, when confronted with the power of his adversary, the devil, the admission of legal guilt, even in court, is brought about through rejection and exclusion, not by fact-finding, not through deep introspection, but by the power and force and weight of the crime control apparatus that comes down upon them and their families. The river boils, the sea bleeds, the rock and God reject you. While social service agencies have long waiting lists, affordable housing options are scarce, and employers, landlords, and their family members reject them at every turn. This is in part due to the proliferation of electronic background checks, the advent of which Sarah Lagerson has theorized as a kind of digital punishment, or what Susula Gurusamy has described as the, quote, carceral web, where credit alerts don't come through our emails or text messages when there's a data breach, or when one of those big companies sells our data to places like Cambridge Analytica, but when a so-called sex offender moves just a few miles away from our home, or when someone on a violent offender registry moves into our neighborhood, that's when I get a text message. What's worse, the confession does not absolve the sinner from their sin, but it brands them, marking the conventional citizen as criminal for life and sentencing them to punishment for a lifetime. Hence Simone's lyric, "The devil is waiting." But to more fully capture what life is like under these conditions, we have to turn away from the impulse to focus on the violent apparent in what we might call a carceral archive. This is the one that we've constructed by tabulating arrest rates and the size of the criminal justice system that we've enacted, or perhaps even tracking school suspensions or the force of poverty and shaping the trajectories of the people whom we've learned to fear. These exercises, while incredibly important, don't acknowledge the informal mechanisms that are at play in the legal exclusion of poor people, the legal exclusion of the criminalized, the legal exclusion of the sinner and the sinner man. Following Saidiya Hartman, we have to try to encounter the wretched in a state of freedom instead, or at least in the moments of almost freedom that they manage to steal away under the suffocating realities and everyday violence emblematic of the carceral condition. That is, we have to map the contours of their increasingly supervised life, this is absolutely the case, and note how social and formal legal controls constrain their lives. But if we want to better understand the worlds they inhabit, we must look beyond formal mechanisms into the informality of their everyday interactions, into the ways that law and policy get taken up amongst their family and friends, in the ways that the carceral condition shapes their most intimate of relationships. But to do that, we have to reimagine the problem. This, of course, is the world's most famous graph, or at least one of the world's most famous graphs. It is a cataloging of the US incarceration rate beginning in the 1920s and moving forward. And it shows in the United States things that most folks in this room likely know, which is that for 27 straight years, we arrested and incarcerated more people than we did in the year before, and we did it at a higher rate. That incarceration was concentrated within social groups. That this was an experience that was born disproportionately among a particular social group, among poor black men in the United States. We'll start with the stats for black Americans. We know that black people are twice as likely to be arrested, 5 times more likely to be incarcerated, and 60% of black Americans who drop out of high school will be incarcerated at some point in their lifetime, and 30% of even those who do graduate. But we also know that it doesn't stop at the black family. We know that Latinx people in the United States are 1.3 times more likely to be incarcerated or have a higher incarceration rate. We know that poor white people in the United States represent something like 38% of American jails and prisons. In fact, there was a study that came out in 2016 that told us that something like 49% of black boys, a reference to the prior stat, would be arrested before they turn 23 years old. 49%. There was another study that told us that something like 1 in 2 black women had a loved one who was currently incarcerated. The prior study that followed the arrest trajectories of poor black boys, of black boys generally, also told us that something like 38% of white boys would be arrested before they turn 23. But white people haven't been separated from their innocence in the same way in the United States as black boys have, so we don't concentrate on that question. When we think about mass incarceration, we typically think about black people only. The same study that told us that 1 in 2 black women has a loved one who's been to an American jail or prison tells us, the very same study, that 1 in 8 white women has a loved one who's currently sitting in an American jail or prison. In fact, the stats tell us that if we released every black person from an American jail or prison today, we still have one of the largest prison systems in the world in the United States. But when President Trump talks about what he did for the, quote, blacks, he talks about criminal justice reform. The truth is we punish our poor. Something like 57% of men and 72% of women live below the poverty line. In fact, up to 80% of folks who are locked away in American jails or prison qualify as indigent for the purposes of legal defense. And mass incarceration is the culmination of many kinds of crises. It's a public health crisis. This is things that we knew before the COVID-19 pandemic, for example, that HIV prevalence is something something like 5 times higher inside American jails or prisons. That hepatitis C, something like 9 times higher inside American jails or prisons. We knew that. One study had told us that something like well over a third of all communicable diseases had passed through an American jail or prison in the year before it expressed itself in the general population. And we knew that the population was rapidly aging, that the prisoners were getting old, dying from things like dementia and Alzheimer's disease on the inside. These were things that we knew long before the COVID-19 pandemic. And we know that mass incarceration is a mental health crisis. 15% of people in prison and 20% of people in jail experience something like a serious mental illness. And that jails and prisons in the United States are the largest mental health provider in 44 out of 50 of our states. The largest mental health provider. But the focus on jails and prisons leaves a curious, yet really important phenomena hidden in plain sight, the rise of what I write about as a supervised society. And to do that, to understand it, we have to put the prison in its place for a hot second. So a few more numbers, and then we'll get back to the stories. So this is a bar graph. Now, I'm an ethnographer by training. I'm not a statistician, right? So this is the most statistical know-how you're gonna get out of me all day. Just forget about it. And I know that a bar graph in relation to nothing else means nothing, but we're gonna go with it anyway. We're gonna go with it anyway. This represents the 2 million people who are held in American jail or prison on any given day. About 2 million people in the US. The high point was 2.4 million, that was in 2008. But we know if we compare that to the number of people on probation or parole, that there's a crisis of what scholars like Fergus McNeil and Crystal Baynes might call mass supervision. We know that something like 5 million people are on probation or parole in any given year in the United States, a figure twice the size of the number of people who are held in American jail or prison. Now, to demonstrate my lack of statistical know-how, we're gonna switch the unit of analysis. We'll do something unfair and switch the unit of analysis, which again is not fair, but let's roll with it anyway. So if we go from a point in time count, which is the unit of analysis when we think about currently incarcerated people or people who are on probation or parole, to the number of people who pass through an institution in a given year, we know that jails in the United States process something like 11 million people a year. 11 million people a year process through a jail. This figure, switching the unit analysis again, this figure is eclipsed when we compare it to the number of people who are estimated to have been through a prison system who are alive today with a felony record. 19.6 million Americans are estimated to have a felony record. These are things we've known since 2016. This is Sarah Shannon's paper from 2010, actually. This figure is 10 times the size of the US jail or prison system. But it's a figure that gets no attention, or very little. But even this figure is dwarfed by the number of Americans estimated to have a criminal record. Remember I told you about just the size and scale of the way we punish, and who we punish, and how we punish. It's disproportionately concentrated among poor Black people, for sure. The 19 million Americans who are incarcerated, a third of which, 19 million Americans who have a felony record, a third of which are Black, representing something like a third of Black people, somewhere around there. But for criminal records, the Bureau of Justice Statistics estimated in 2014 that 80 million Americans had a criminal record. 1/3 of all US adults has some sort of criminal record. 1/3. So what this tells us is that communities where the action is, and the prison, despite its place in the public's imagination, is just one relatively small slice of a much larger carceral network. This is a screenshot of the National Inventory of the Collateral Consequences of a Criminal Conviction. So I'd like to ask what this means. What does it mean to touch so many people at such a great scale? A third of Americans touched by the criminal justice system. An underestimate, by the way. The Bureau of Justice Statistics didn't want to overcount. They didn't want to double count. They estimated 100 million Americans had a criminal record. This is a screenshot of the National Inventory of the Collateral Consequences of Criminal Conviction. A collateral consequence are kind of legal sanctions that follow people with criminal records that lock them out of the political economy and culture. And what they did was they counted the number of laws, policies, and administrative sanctions that target people with criminal records and only people with criminal records. And they counted them across states. And when they added the number up, they found that there were over 44,000 laws, policies, and sanctions that target people with criminal records. 44,000. Phil talks about institutional versus institutionalized racism. This is one of the conversations we were having at lunch today. And institutionalized, when something is institutionalized, means it's baked in. This is just how we write law and policy. It's just how we do it. We write law and policy to exclude, specifically people with criminal records. But the devil's always in the details. This is a screenshot of my home state of Illinois, where in one state, there are over 1,400 of those laws, including 583 that limit the acquisition of business licenses and property rights. When we talk about things like entrepreneurship for people who are formerly excluded from the economy, let's say they want to start a business or something like that, 583 laws and policies prevent people from doing those kinds of things. 556 target employment, meaning there are entire categories of employment for which people need not apply if you have a criminal record. 186 limit political and civic participation. 54 constrain family and domestic rights. 21 limit access to housing. So what does this mean? This means in most states, you can't hold public office if you have a criminal record. In my home state, you couldn't groom a dog. You couldn't be a dog groomer. In my home state, you can't be in a bingo parlor, right? Do people play bingo here? Do you all, right? You know, mostly grandmas play bingo, right? Like not, and no offense to grandmas, whatever, but mostly grandmas play bingo. The presumption is that there's some nefarious actor waiting in the shadows, right, at the bingo hall. You couldn't be a barber in my home state until a legislative change that happened in 2016. It took an act of Congress to allow people who had been trained as barbers on the inside to be barbers when they came home. It took an act of Congress. You may have to give up your parental rights. In the US, something like 30,000 people have had their parental rights terminated for issues other than child abuse and neglect. Most had their parental rights terminated because of an act, the Adoption and Safe Families Act, which set a guideline for when termination proceedings would begin. And they said, you can't be in jail or prison for longer than 18 months. When that happens, the guideline would be termination proceedings would automatically begin for those folks. But states, because we have a federated system, because of the way our system is enacted, and pardon me for stuttering so much, different things happen in different states. So a state like Florida will start proceedings after about 6 months of incarceration. Your job applications can be denied. You may be fired or evicted on a whim. Your relationships look fundamentally different. So what does incarceration do? Quite obviously, it produces precarity. It exacerbates health and mental health issues. It filters into the dynamics of the American family. How could it not? It produces other kinds of revolving doors. When we talk about revolving doors, we typically think about recidivism rates. And that's one kind. A door that revolves in and out of prisons, people being arrested quite a bit. And that shows up when we look at, for example, that giant recidivism study that came out in 2014, which showed us that after about 5 years, the recidivism rate in the United States is something like 77%. It fails ridiculously. After 9 years, it's 83%. But what that also shows us, so that's one kind, in and out of jails or prisons, but it also showed us that people in the study, about 44% of the folks who participated in that study have been arrested, or the sample, have been arrested 10 times on average. 10 times. What does it mean to be arrested 10 times? That's one kind of revolving door. One kind, but there's another. This is a revolving door in and out of homelessness. People we lock away are 7 times more likely to experience homelessness than members of the general population. And if you've been arrested twice or more, you're 13 times more likely to experience homelessness in the United States. Black women, of course, were the most housing insecure in this sample. And of course, there's a disability to incarceration pipeline. Something like 38% of the people we lock away experience some form of disability, be that a cognitive disability, some sort of ambulatory disability, like some sort of vision-based disability. And how do we respond? We respond with social services. We respond with case managers. We respond with the long shadow of broken windows policing, where we criminalize squeegee men and we lock them away and throw them in our jails. We respond by criminalizing the poor. We respond by overwhelmingly denying disability claims on the inside. I was following homeless outreach workers as a part of my research, which I haven't talked about methods at all, and I might get to that at some point. but when I was following homeless outreach workers, and I was on Lower Wacker Drive, which is a famous homelessness encampment in the city of Chicago, and it's in downtown Chicago, and it's in the posh neighborhoods in Chicago where everybody's got a gang of money. And so the city had passed a law that said you can't have furniture on the streets. You can't have something like furniture on the streets. And they were trying to clear out folks who have furniture on the streets. But really great social service actors and agencies wanted to make sure that people had the things they needed. And so there was a team, an outreach team, and it consisted of a social worker and a police officer. Of course, a social worker and a police officer. And a garbage man. And they walked down Lower Wacker Drive, and the social worker would walk up and they'd offer services to the person who was sleeping on the street with their furniture. If the person refused, the police officer was there to back them up as they looked over to the garbage man with a giant garbage truck humming just 10 feet behind them. And they'd be directed to throw away their things. If there was a problem on the street, they'd of course be arrested. This was social services in Chicago. Now these are stats, largely. We've been hanging out about 30,000 feet in the air for the most part for the last few minutes. And stats by definition are abstractions. This isn't how people live. It's not how they experience social life. But I want to bring you with me into the life of a man that I call Jimmy Caldwell and where we meet. So I would do work. My research, I'm primarily an ethnographer, and I did field work across a few American cities, Chicago largely, Detroit, but also a bunch of cities in between. I was in LA, I was in smaller towns all across the city. And the first 3.5 years of my work, I was doing ethnography out of halfway houses. And then I started doing work when I took a job at the University of Michigan, and I would follow people out of jails and prisons in the city of Detroit. And I followed them for about 2 years. And then after that, I followed a group of activists, formerly incarcerated activists, who were trying to change the law and policy regimes that hem them in. And I did that work for several years. And I'm meeting Jimmy, and he's in a place called the Detroit Detention Center. And what happened at the detention center was that there was so much abuse inside police stations. They had failed so many human rights inspections. People had died in custody. There'd be lockup facilities that would hold hundreds of men. There'd be like one working toilet. There'd be cells with no light or one light that's hanging. They forget to feed them. And so the state of Michigan took over the lockup facilities inside the city of Detroit. And so I stationed myself, and so they opened an institution called the Detroit Detention Center, and I'd station myself in the detention center. This is anyone who got arrested in the city would be transferred to the Detroit Detention Center. They'd be arraigned and then shipped off to the jail later. And so because everyone who had been arrested would pass through there, that's where I did my field work in Detroit. And so I stationed myself there at the detention center. This was 2014, and it was the winter. And I would head to the muster room. This is a cell where people were about to be released, and they waited for the final buzzer and the final gray steel and plexiglass door to slide open. I should say that there were two places where I did this field work. One place was the detention center. The other place was the Detroit Reentry Center. And this is where this takes place. The Reentry Center was the other side of the detention center, and it was the place that offered programming for people who were coming out of a prison. And so these folks had been away. Some folks had been locked up for just a few hours, but some folks had been gone for several years. Well, anyway, here I was waiting in the muster room, and I noticed that the people who were sitting on that side didn't realize that their loved ones were on just the other side of that door waiting to pick them up. And so when the final door buzzed, the men inside would walk out and reunite with their loved ones. This was always a lovely scene. A father might hug his boy close. A grandmother would reach up from her seat to embrace her long since grown child, her walker between them. There was always some exchange between the people released from their cages and the people that picked them up. Even when they were in a hurry to leave, there'd be some intimate conversation or just a few words between each pairing, maybe a nod or glance or eyes that danced nervously from a lover to the floor, or maybe a parent would acknowledge how much a child had grown since they had last seen them. All of it signaling that their loved one was cared for, even if he made a mistake, even if she hadn't seen him for some time. Some people made a beeline for the exit, their loved one trailing close behind, but the relief on their face when the last door buzzed was almost always there. They had been to prison, but now they were on their way home. Taking in this scene, I almost missed Jimmy, who walked out of the detention center alone. He showed up early with a cup of coffee in the waiting area of the center where we would do the first interview. And everyone who met Jimmy commented on how nice he was. He was a stocky man, but he appeared somehow vulnerable, hanging on your every word as if it mattered in some profound way. And while he looked at you directly when he talked, he never made eye contact. So I invited him from the table where he was drinking coffee with lots of cream and sugar to the room where we'd have our first interview. Jimmy moved quickly, so we went over the basics quickly. He had a 10th grade education. He'd been arrested 20 times. High school was hard. He tried Job Corps. This is a service for people to get vocational training instead of going to jail or prison. He sold dope, used dope, went to prison for property crimes after a 3-year sentence for grand larceny and finishing the 6-month drug treatment program where I met him. He told me that he was happy about being in treatment. And he used lots of treatment language. He talked about the people, places, and things, and codependence, and enablers, and my madness, and my disease. But I wondered about his life. To get to that, I need to get beyond the things he learned to say in treatment groups and beyond the stories you hear when you watch black gangster movies from the 1990s. This is because black life in cities like Detroit have been so caricatured, and these caricatures have led to terrible policy, welfare reform, the war on crime, 1 million mentorship programs to try to replace missing black fathers. This is despite 2 full decades of research that tell us that black fathers are there. That in fact, black American men are more active in their lives, according to the CDC study that came out in 2013, than men from every other racial or ethnic group in the United States. That black fathers help with homework and go to games and share moments of affection like all fathers. But the news about exceptional black men who teach low-income kids complicated handshakes, or the YouTube clips that would circulate about principals doing the latest dance move with little black boys and girls, or the viral videos of police officers shooting baskets with kids in dreadlocks, or the first day of school, the images that circulate on social media about the first day of school where 100 black men would show up on that day and there'd be some caption like real men or real fathers. This would convince us that this is abnormal. But it wasn't just bad policy decisions, and it wasn't just the caricatures. 1,000 studies on missing black men and 1,000 more on what sociologists call social disorganization. This shows up in the first interview I do with anybody I talk to. So do slogans that moralize black lives and things that preachers and pundits and presidents say at gatherings of black men, like the time Obama came to Morehouse University, a literal prep school, to tell men that they need to pull their pants up. They need to not, being a man is not about siring many women. He's at a prep school. It's literally a prep school. The preeminent black institution where no other than the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King himself graduated. This is Obama's message to black men. All of this comes up within the first hour of every interview. This is, of course, social desirability bias, meaning that people tell you the stories they think you want to hear. Now, there are interview techniques to get around this, but it takes more than a few hours and a few cups of coffee to really get to the heart of the matter. So I'd ask Jimmy about his life, what it meant for him to be coming home, and I'd ask him about his family. I'm the only boy, he said confidently. He told me he had 4 sisters. When I asked where he was in the pecking order, he sat up in his chair, laughing. I'm the baby, he said. You're the baby? I said, thinking I knew what he meant. When I told him, I'm the baby too, we laughed together loudly. 2 middle-aged men sitting in an office in Midtown, decades removed from my childhood, thinking about some pleasant thing from so long ago. So the story that Jimmy told me was about his childhood and about growing up and about how his father was there for his brothers and sisters and about how he saw him every day, but how he died of cancer and how his mother had trouble raising 4 boys on her own. And he told me the story about how he found his way into crime and criminality. And he told me the story about the many times he was arrested over and over again, the last time being an 8-year stint in a Michigan penitentiary for grand larceny. He had set up what he called a Home Depot. This was a spot inside an abandoned building where he was selling things that he stole. And he told me about the many things that he had to do. He said that the judge, when he had gotten out, had ordered him to report to drug treatment several times a week, to go to workforce development programming and to get a job. And so I decided to follow him to workforce development training. And Jimmy told me when we went there that if he'd missed any of his appointments, any of the many things that he had to do, that he thought he might be rearrested, that he might have to go back to jail or prison. And he wasn't wrong. The stats tell us that this is absolutely the case. About a quarter of all prison admissions are for parole violations, things like missing appointments, pissing hot. Pissing hot might be you had a drink and you showed up and you popped hot for alcohol at the probation offices when you showed up at the probation office. And so I decided, because of all this precarity, that I would follow Jimmy. I tried to understand his life. And the first place that he had to go to was this workforce development agency. So it's 2014 and it's cold. It is the coldest day of the year. It's one of those days where you see your breath. It's a bone-chillingly cold day in the city of Detroit. And we have to walk. We have to walk about a half hour because the last bus stop is about a mile from where the agency is. And so we're moving along, and I'm following Jimmy, and I'm trying to understand what's happening. We're trying to get to the appointment. And the whole time, Jimmy is complimenting me, which makes me uncomfortable. He's telling me what a great guy he thinks I am for listening to people's stories like this. He tells me that he's just glad to be doing something positive, that he appreciated hanging out with a brother like you. That's what he told me. I didn't know why he was buttering me up, but then by the time we got to the Workforce Development Agency, which I said was about a half hour from where we were, I understood. The building was closed. And I don't mean closed for the day. There was a loose leaf sheet of paper taped to the front, to the glass window that had a few hopefully open workforce development agencies, the closest of which was 9 miles from where we were in that moment. And Jimmy told me that he didn't have bus fare, and I knew that he didn't because he would rely on the $40 that I gave him and the bus cards that I gave him in exchange for the interviews to get around from week to week. And Jimmy didn't have a cell phone. He had a prepaid cell phone, at least in this moment in time in 2014. He used to buy cell phones and put minutes on them, and he had long since run out of minutes. And even if he had a cell phone, there was no phone number on the slip of paper in this building, this gray stone monstrosity in the center of Midtown that was shuttered, closed, not for the day, but forever, that he was told that he must report to. And so I made a decision in that moment. I said, yo, Jimmy, I'll tell you what, jump in my car, I'll give you a ride, and we'll make our way to the bus station. Now, I'm an ethnographer. I'm supposed to be understanding what people experience from day to day in the way that they experience it. It is a violation of my research protocol to put Jimmy in my car, just to say. And I like to tell people that I put him in my car because he was a nice guy in a bad situation. But the truth is, I didn't much like Jimmy. He kept complimenting me. He kept telling me how nice I was. So we drive through Detroit traffic. We get to the social service agency. We walk in. And we learn that there are no spaces in the social service agency for Jimmy. The case manager, whoever it was we were talking to, tells him to put his name on a list in case another parolee fails to show up the next week, and he can maybe take that spot. But there was no place for him. So we grab a brochure, we make small talk, and we run to a Detroit diner chain called Coney Island in Detroit. And while we're sitting down, Jimmy is thanking me profusely. He thanks me for the $7 breakfast that I buy him. He thanks me for the time that I spent with him listening to his story. And he thanks me for being there, he says. Thank you for being there. And it struck me, like being there, what do you mean being there? You couldn't even get into the social service. I took you, but you couldn't get into the social service agency. Thank you for being there. What did I do? It turns out Jimmy's life moved from one rejection to another. The first agency was closed. I didn't tell you that when he went to prison the first time, he was told Jimmy had a bipolar diagnosis. He was told that he didn't have a mental health issue, he had a drug issue, and he was taken off his medication. He couldn't get a job because of the 19,000 labor market restrictions that target people with criminal records. He's told no in the labor market all the time. The agency was closed. He couldn't get there without help, and even with my help, by the time we got there, the agency, they couldn't see him anyway. His life moved from one rejection to the next. being there, he says. But I didn't do very much at all. I want to talk to you about another brother. This guy's I call Zoe. And this will help us bring home the point of legal exclusion, how it shows up and shapes the lives of people with criminal records. This is the 28th day of Zoe's almost freedom. Now, to tell you a bit about Zoe, Zoe was a drug robber. He went to prison for the crime of robbing dope dealers. And I met him and followed him. And by the time we catch up, he's telling me about his life and experiences. He shows up to a halfway house that he's told to report to on the other side of town. He's from the west side. This is a neighborhood that we call K-Town on the west side. It's a neighborhood where all the street names begin with K. And Zoe's told to report to a different neighborhood, a neighborhood called Auburn Gresham, which is as far, just on the opposite end of the city. And he's worried that when he gets there, there's going to be trouble. And of course there is, because he has to cross gang lines. It's very far from where he was. He had never really spent a substantial amount of time on the inside. And when he shows up, he knocks on the door and he's wearing his fresh fish khakis, a white short sleeve shirt. And he knocks on the door of the halfway house and the person takes his paperwork from the jail. The halfway house is paid for the first 30 days. And then after that, he has to find a place to stay. He's given the rules by the person who opens the door: no guests, no pets, no smoking, or at least smoke outside. Hand over your food stamps each month. We collect the food stamps and we divide them amongst each other. This is how we feed you. The rent is $400. It's due on the first of the month. There are no eviction orders in this place, no eviction notices. You don't get a 5-day notice before you get evicted. If you don't have the money, you just have to go. And Zoe had been many things, but he had never been homeless. So here we are 28 days later, 28 days into Zoe's almost freedom. He couldn't find a job, of course, because like Jimmy, the labor market restrictions have prevented him from doing that. And Zoe had gone to prison for shooting somebody, so nobody was going to hire Zoe. And he had been many things. He had been to many prisons downstate. He had been to juvenile detention. He had been in halfway houses of all kinds, but he had never been homeless. He didn't know what that felt or tasted like. And so he decided to gather his things because he didn't want to be put out. And he'd walk the streets. He gathered his things and he's walking the streets and he's got his stuff in a black garbage bag, a big black garbage bag. And he's thinking about what he's going to do. He realizes he can't tell his probation officer what's about to happen. He can't tell him he's about to be homeless because, again, homelessness is a violation of parole. And he tells me, what does he see as he's walking around? He says, there are 2 dope boys on the corner talking their little shit, flashing their little cash. He said, I didn't know what to do. But as I probed, I learned that he did. He was a drug robber. He told me he had muscle memory. I felt like I could have just choked them boys out, he said. But there were 2 of them, and he didn't want to go back to prison. Now, I'm not saying that people commit crime only because of material conditions. We know that some people commit crimes because they want to. There's a great book called The Seductions of Crime, and there's a chapter in that book on University of Chicago students, for example, the school that I teach at, that talks about how these University of Chicago students would often steal for the, quote, sneaky thrills of stealing. They stole because they wanted to. And there's a chapter on torture, there's an introduction on torture that talk about the rhythms that people get into when they're engaging in the act of torture. The beatings, the slaps, the movement, the dance of torture often draws the torturer into the act. People sometimes commit crimes because they want to. I know people who say they shoot because they wanted to. There's real power and thrill in having power and taking power of somebody else. Everybody doesn't commit crime because they're hungry. But here's Zoe. He didn't have the $400. And there was no way to make it. He'd applied for many jobs and had been rejected. But even if somebody called, it'd have taken too long. And even if somebody called, would he have made $400 at minimum wage at that moment in time? Probably not. So he's standing here with this decision on that corner, wanting to choke these boys out because he knows what to do. So what did you do, Zoe? I cried, man, he said. I stood on that corner and I cried. This is citizenship in the carceral age. This is not just about criminal behavior. Opportunities are impossible for somebody like Jimmy, who's struggling with a drug addiction, who's struggling with mental health issues, who's trying his best to make a life for himself, to get on his feet. Zoe and Jimmy live in an alternate legal reality. 19,000 labor market restrictions, 4,000 restrictions on civic participation, 1,000 housing restrictions. This is a question of exclusion, not just behavior, not whether or not Zoe actually choked those boys out. How does Zoe get on this corner in this moment in this predicament? This is a problem that filters into even our most intimate relationships. I caught up with Jimmy and I asked him about his mother because I met his mother. She's a wonderful woman. You know, she's nice and sweet and lovely and loves Jimmy. And she would often care for Jimmy when he would be in and out of jails and prisons. Jimmy was very hard to support after a while. He got hooked on drugs, all these things happened I talked to you about. And he told me that, you know, he hadn't talked to his mother in a while. And I asked him, why? Why haven't you talked to your mother in a while? He said, well, I don't really come around like that no more, he said. I said, why not? Why are you staying away from your mom? Your mom's gonna look out for you. She loves you. He told me that his mother's landlord started, quote, asking questions. The landlord told the mother that if Jimmy came around anymore, if she let Jimmy sleep on the couch, that he would be, quote, forced to evict her. Now, this seems inhumane until we think about the 1989 Drug Abuse Act, until we think about the 1996 State of the Union address from President Bill Clinton that said we take crime fighting to housing. This seems inhumane of the landlord until we realize that law and policy made it so that people with criminal records could be evicted from their homes without notice, but that people who so much as allowed people with criminal records to stay in the home could also be evicted according to this set of laws that were passed during the war on drugs. He says, I don't come around her like that anymore. He says, I don't want to put her in that position. Jimmy, who obviously needs help, stays away from the person who could help the most and who wants to help the most because he knows that she will help him. This is the price of what I write about as carceral citizenship, where exclusion from the political economy and culture shape the social lives of the city. Where we see laws on top of laws, the 44,000 laws and policies for people with criminal records, the standard legal code, and also something like the conditions of release that someone like Jimmy is handed when he walks out of a jail or prison that tells him he must, for example, go to drug treatment. You must go to workforce development. You must piss in a cup. And if you violate any of these things, you will go back to jail or prison. There's a different set of expectations for people that we've criminalized than there are for everybody else. It's not something you can treat your way out of. So what can be done? We have to remember that mass incarceration is a series of crises. It's a public health crisis. It's a housing crisis. It's an employment and political crisis because it's a crisis of legitimacy, at least for the state. It's ultimately, though, a problem of citizenship, a problem of political membership. And we can, of course, think carefully about who we elect. We can think about the law and policy mechanisms that those people sort of write in a given moment in time. Out of fear, we've legislated 44,000 laws and policies because that's how we write law and policy. We do this in the name of public safety. But any criminologist worth their salt will tell you that housing instability, that separation from loved ones, as in Jimmy's case, and in the case of many people, that unemployment lead to more crime and not less. Out of fear, we look for safety. Out of fear, we've legislated a less safe world. So what we have to do is we have to take a risk. We have to be vulnerable. We have to make a place for people in the world who've caused harm, even for people we're afraid of. This isn't the end of their story. Jimmy stays out of prison largely because he finds a network of support. His mother risks eviction and lets him stay. He's got his old dope dealer allows him a place to live, and he's rehabbing abandoned houses and lets him stay in those houses. He's got a pastor that he met and a girlfriend that he got, through that church that used to write him letters while he was in prison, telling him she awaited the next letter from him and was there for him when he came home. And Lorenzo also finds his footing. This is because a spot opens. He gets on the train in that moment where he cries instead of choking out the dope boys. He gets on the train, he rides an hour and a half to another West Side halfway house, a good one. And this place has a spot, but it doesn't initially have an opening. In fact, the program manager lets Lorenzo sleep on the couch until a spot opens in the house. And when it does, he takes to it. He takes to it because it's an opportunity and he jumps on it. He gets hired initially as a groundskeeper. He gets promoted from groundskeeper to house manager. He gets promoted from house manager to program manager. Now he's the executive director of the organization that let him in. Has a wife and a young family. He's got a house and a car that he brags about. And he's doing very well. But he's doing very well because people fill in the gaps that are left in the wake of state failure. He does well because people take risks that they shouldn't have to take. And this is how we get free. Not through individual level intervention. No, it's not enough. The too many Jimmys, too many Zoes that never make it. Structural problems require structural solutions. We have to advocate for change in law and policy. We've got 44,000 laws and policy. Do we need 44,000? It must always be the question. What we've learned from 30 years of reentry research is that resource-rich institutions and resource-poor people don't often come together. They need a bridge. And that's what organizations like the Halfway House, the good one, that Zoe found, operate as a bridge to resource-rich institutions. We have to promote the intrinsic humanity of people in this situation, no matter what they did. We have to launch a careful media campaign that centers experience over outcomes. The stats is not where we live. We have to move beyond recidivism and employment statistics, the central measures of success. It doesn't tell us anything. It just tells us about the degree of legal exclusion that someone experiences. And I think we have to focus on human thriving rather than simply risk reduction. More importantly, I think we have to listen to formerly incarcerated people. The most effective organizations in the history of my country, but I think in the history of most countries, were led by people directly impacted by the problem they were facing. The civil rights movement was not led by white people. Women's rights movement has not been led by men. The LGBTQ rights movement has not been led by straight people. You see what I'm saying? One last story to hammer this home. Above all, we have to take risks. Above all, we have to take risks. Above all, we have to move beyond our overwhelming focus on issues of public safety and think more carefully about human thriving. The reason why I'm saying this is the question that we have to ask ourselves is, what does this person need to thrive? Not what do I need to be to keep myself safe from them? And I want to hammer this home with one last point. My dear brother, Ronald Simpson Bay, he's a lion in the movement for justice for formerly incarcerated people. He was wrongfully convicted and did 27 years for the crime of shooting a police officer. This was the crime. It turns out, of course, he didn't do it. He wasn't at the scene of the crime. This isn't to say that Ronald is a great guy. He is a great guy. He's a great guy now. But Ronald was a gun-toting, dope dealing. You know what I mean? Like Ronald is, Ronald was a real person. But he didn't kill that cop. He didn't shoot that cop. In fact, the cop didn't even get killed. Ronald got 50 years for an officer who got shot. And the bullet grazed the officer's finger. 50 years. Anyway. But Ronald wasn't he wasn't some angel. No, not at all. He's doing 27 years on this wrongful conviction. And about a decade into the time he's spending fighting his wrongful conviction, he gets a call and he learns that his son, a child who holds his name, Ronald Jr., was murdered. And he was murdered by a 14-year-old boy. I asked Ronald what it was like in those days. And he said it was hard. He said, he fought a lot. He was in the hole a lot. It's impossible to be around him for the first few years. He was grieving. He was angry, both in jail for a wrongful conviction and his son is murdered, his namesake. So that's what he did. And Ronald said, well, and this is what he did, this is documented fact. Ronald is a jailhouse lawyer. He's gotten many people out of jail and prison. He's one of the best jailhouse lawyers in the state of Michigan while he was on the inside. You know, this often happens. There's a prison library and folks become sort of expert, sort of legal advocates. He got many people out. And so what he did was he took that legal acumen and he advocated for the murderer of his child, the 14-year-old boy who killed his son. And he asked the judge, because in this time in the state of Michigan, children were being tried as adults almost automatically if you were convicted of the crime of murder. And so the boy was going to get a life sentence. The 14-year-old boy was going to be in prison for life. And he tried to advocate for the kid. He wrote the judge and he wrote the state's attorney, and he said to them, try this boy as a juvenile, not an adult. But they wouldn't listen because they couldn't see Ronald as a victim. They could only see Ronald as the guy who shot a cop. And so he started a letter writing campaign. He reached out to the NAACP, and he reached out to Jesse Jackson's Operation Push, and he got 5,000 letters sent to the DA's office, sent to the judge, and they tried the juvenile as an adult. This is a beautiful story. It's wonderful. Ronald's an amazing guy and all these things. But I wondered if this was like a really sentimental movie or something like that. Like, Ronald, are you like, what's going on right now? Are you all like doing tours? Are you having pizza together? Do you have him over your house for dinner? You know, did you take him as your own son? Do you love this child? He said, no, I didn't love him. He killed my son. Why'd you do it? I couldn't have done it. I don't think I could have. He said, I did it because it was the right thing to do. I made an ethical commitment. I did what those ethics required. So they're not touring on the lecture circuit. There could be a movie made about their life. It's not happening. Ronald made a place for someone who caused him harm. And this was at great risk. This was at great risk. I said, Ronald, did you forgive the boy? He said, eventually I forgave the boy. But that's not when he started the advocacy work. He started the advocacy work because of his ethical commitment. He told me, Reuben, forgiveness without works is dead. That's what he told me. Ronald engages in a radical politics of hospitality. This is what we need. This is great vulnerability. This kid could commit another crime. And if he does, this exonerated man will be okay with it because he made an ethical commitment and he's doing what his ethics require. He might be disappointed by it. He might be hurt by it. But he did what was right because it was the right thing. So I think we live in strange and marvelous times. I think we're paying attention to these kinds of questions in ways that we never have before. I don't think we've ever paid as much attention to the criminal justice system as we have before. You know, I'm very grateful for the MacArthur Award and stuff like that. I'm grateful for me, of course. Like, you know, I got an ego, and it was great to get the call. It was wild. But I'm also grateful because of the work, because what they're saying is, you know, the work you do is valuable, and the work I do are with folks like this, people that we've forgotten, people that we throw away. And so more than, I don't mean, oh, it's not about me. That's not what I'm saying at all. Like, I'm not saying that. Like this sort of fake move where people are like, it's not really about me. That's not what I'm saying. No, but really, it is really about a recognition of people that we've learned to be afraid of. And that to me is evidence of kind of this moment that we're in, which I find marvelous and strange. Strange also, because if we let go of every black prisoner, we'd have one of the largest criminal justice systems in the world. If we let go every prisoner, if we set them all free today, we'd still have this policy apparatus, what I call a supervised society. And so I think it requires us to ask different kinds of questions. I've been trying to ask different empirical questions, different theoretical questions, but the question before us is really an ethical one, as Ronald asked. We live in a supervised society. The question for us is, what kind of society do we want? Thank you.